Good morning. Everybody had a good evening? Good breakfast? Are we ready for an inspiring keynote? So this will be something probably you've not seen before. I am very proud to introduce Robin DeRosa, who is the director of the Teaching and Learning Collaborative at Plymouth State University. And her work is centered around open education, open pedagogy, making learning accessible to students, and interdisciplinarity. And I will let her do the rest. Thank you, Robin.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for having me here. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be here in Egypt for the first time and to visit my good friend Maha, who I have not met in person before now, so it's very exciting to me. I will also tell you that I'm terrified right now because there's more technology in front of me than I've seen in a long time, and all of it's tied to the cloud, and I don't know what's happening in the cloud, so we'll see if it works. But I beg your forgiveness if we go off the track, as we certainly will at certain points. So we are going to do something a little bit different today, and I'll try to introduce that to you now. Universities are, in many ways, centers. They are places of coherence with focused and often noble missions related to learning and education. But as we develop these centers for knowledge exploration, we also develop margins. As we create insides that we hope will be welcoming and accessible, we also ironically create outsides that are distinctly not part of our learning ecosystem. And keynote addresses are an interesting metaphor for this irony. A traditional keynote has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has a main point, an argument delivered as a monologue, and a locus of authority. A keynote address shares a lot of structural characteristics with our colleges and universities, and our courses and our assignments. There's no room for margins in a keynote. It's all flash, all power, all center. I'm curious about open education, about making college more affordable, about how we can really listen to students and design opportunities based on what they truly need. But today I also want to be curious about how we argue for what we want to change. I want to be less sure, more open, more questioning, and more radical in my desire to rethink learning. At the heart here is my love for the students we serve and for the students whom we haven't yet figured out how to serve. I started out by thinking of all the students I've lost in so many ways over the years, as well as the students I've celebrated when they've made it through by using every ounce of blood and sweat and luck that they could muster. I started thinking about what we've all lost when we lost students and what we all gained when we found a way to support students who were just scraping by. There were too many stories to tell, and none of them lined up into anything perfect. There was no keynote there, only the work of loving and the work of teaching. But what I did find were a lot of impressions and experiences and threads about learning on the edges, about learning in and around and under and just outside of the shiny colleges and universities that we advertise in our viewbooks, the ones that only exist for a small number of our learners and for a small number of us. Today's unkeynote is a way for me to share these impressions with you, and I'm going to ask two things. First, don't worry that these impressions don't add up, because they're not supposed to. They work together as a collage, not as a linear narrative, and they don't have a point as much as they offer a collective of questions that are intended to be a respite from the solutionism that so often seduces and fails us in higher education. And second, please, please, please participate. At points, I'm going to stop and ask for you to reflect and share your impressions. And like mine, yours can be poetic or half-formed, inquisitive, messy, funny, tiny, vague, or fierce. You can share anonymously or with your name attached. If you choose to share, I'll be building with what you share over the next couple of months in order to turn this unkeynote into a tapestry that we've all revised together. So to get started, I'm going to ask someone brave, to choose a title from this list here. You can choose in any order you like. You can choose whichever you're most curious about. We might not get through all of them, and that's okay. You can read them all later if you want by going to the link there, bit.ly/AMICAL Keynote. You might want to go there now if you prefer to follow along with a transcript because of an accessibility issue, but otherwise just settle back, maybe take out a pen and paper or an electronic device, and get ready to think along with me about what it might mean to build a university of the margins. So now, the brave soul, will someone please call out one of the titles and we'll start the keynote. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Thank you, my friend for life, whoever just did that. And now I'm also clicking a link and we'll see. Oh, so I already messed up, which I knew I would. This is the one we want. All right, not so bad. And I have to click it over here too. There's lots of clicking. I don't keep a lot of books. In college, I sold back almost all of my books for all the reasons that students sell back books. And I kept maybe 10 of my college books, but one of them was Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands La Frontera, the New Mestiza. It changed me in many ways, but I am most struck by a kind of prescience that I had in keeping it, since it's a book I've come to so many times in my professional life, and now is one of those times. Anzaldúa writes, "The New Mestiza has a plural personality. She operates in a pluralistic mode. Nothing is thrust out, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Nothing rejected, nothing abandoned. Not only does she sustain contradictions, she turns the ambivalence into something else." Later, Anzaldúa refers to this plurality as a massive uprooting of dualistic thinking. There's so much here that foreshadows Bell Hook's piece, who writes on margins as a space of radical openness. What's most interesting to me is the refusal to resolve ambiguity, the call to sustain contradiction. Over the years, I've challenged my type A personality with this call many times. In higher education now, I feel myself constantly torn between my skill at resolving contradiction in ways that score a win for my students or programs, and my suspicion that these resolutions and wins ultimately damage the ecosystem for learning that I imagine a university should be cultivating. Of course, for Anzaldúa, the call to honor and explore contradiction has everything to do with race, culture, and power. I don't want to erase that as I apply their work to questions about educational restructuring. Instead, I want to talk about what universities would look like if scholars of color who've worked for years to theorize these relationships were relied on as much or more than we rely on people like Carnegie, Dewey, Montessori, Maslow, Siemens, a million others when we think about how educational institutions should be designed to serve learners. Would our institutions look different? Would they admit students differently? Would they cost what they cost today? Who would work at them? Who would lead them? How would curriculum look? How about assessment, accreditation, graduation, the student experience? To favor pluralism, acknowledge ugliness, demand inclusion, and mine paradox for its transformative potential, this is not how I feel when I argue for best practice, or establish learning outcomes before my courses even begin, or celebrate selectivity in my institution's admission process, or write program reviews or promotion files that obscure failure, or refuse late assignments from students, use critical mass and market demand as an argument for program development, design marketing campaigns or discounts to nab other public institutions' enrollments, design a new course using a credit model system that's pre-mapped onto the course structure, grade an assignment or grade a student, participate in diversity initiatives that focus on events, artifacts, or visibility. To be clear, the things that I just listed there are not travesties. They're daily life inside a college or university. And lots of these things make sense in some contexts. But so many of them are focused on, well, focusing, on taking something messy and political and painful and unexpected like learning, and turning it into something easily quantified, unambiguous, overly simplistic, and easily tied to tangible metrics for value, like money, credits, grades, and quotas. And I understand from Anzaldúa that when we erase the ambiguity and treat the margins as something to be overcome rather than inhabited, we lose the opportunity to turn the energy of uncertainty, cacophony, and conflict into something else. And I don't think that something else is something specific. It's actually something else, the thing not named or expected, the thing that isn't one thing, the horizon of possibility but not the arrival. It is maybe learning. When we think about unfocusing and living inside ambiguity, I want to understand how that relates to social justice, which is at the core of Anzaldúa's text. But she doesn't start from the question of how to make the dominant shape of the world more equitable. She starts with the lived experience and identity of the Mexican Indian Anglo-Mestiza on the Texas-US Southwest Mexican border. She talks about how to expand the borderlands, sites of conflict and colonization as they are, and amplify the voices of those who identify those sites not only as sites of struggle, but as home. What are the borderlands of an American college or university? And for AMICAL, what are the borderlands of an American college or university that is not in America? The wall that cuts through a borderland does more than separate two regions. It works to shrink the border to a razor's edge, to make it uninhabitable space where mixing can't happen, where humans can't live inside multiple identities, or touch across cultural contradiction, or mine the energy of ambiguity to imagine something else. This is why interdisciplinary innovations inside of universities are exciting to me, because they ask us to think about borderlands as spaces where we can do things. But it's also why interdisciplinary innovations inside of universities irritate me, because they often ask us to package the knowledge borders as new markets or efficiencies or solutions. And these things are not compatible with the vision of Anzaldúa's borderland that so affected my development. Her borderlands were spaces for the collective as opposed to the correct, for the plural rather than the product. What is the cost to learners at the margin, to knowledge and its potential, to diversity, to our humanity? What would a pluralistic structure look like for higher education? What are its risks and who would it serve? What would it mean to design institutions to sustain contradiction in learning? And what does knowledge look like if we uproot dualistic thinking? If our university mission statements co-opt and whitewash the language of the borderland, while our universities build structures to surveil, control, and bisect, we enact the worst and most ironic kind of violence on our own humanity, on others, and on ourselves. So after each of these little snapshots, I'm going to ask you to reflect briefly. And you can do that now. You could also do it later. These are all going to be available. But there's a couple of ways to share. You'll see that bit.ly link. That's a short link. If you type that into your browser, it will take you to a Google Doc. And you can go ahead and type right on that Google Doc right now any impressions that you have. And that could be anything from a word, a question, a thought, a critique. You can also tweet it to AMICALConf, which is the hashtag for this conference, or you can email me something. You can email an image, you can email a paragraph or a statement or a reflection. And all of the things that we collect through the course of the keynote are things that over the next, I'll say 1 to 2 months, so I don't hem myself in too much, are things that I will gather and build back in to the text that's online right now for the conference. So one of the questions spurred by that Anzaldúa piece is, does your university use the language of pluralism or inclusion or opening or mixing to describe its ecosystems or learning processes? And if so, do the structures of your university seem to enable or prevent that kind of experience or community or work? And can you give an example? So for some of these that are smaller and more manageable, we'll really pause and stop. But for now, I hope, even with a first impression, that you'll consider sending a quick tweet or jumping into that Google Doc or jotting a note down on your paper to send later. But for now, we'll go on. Can someone call out? And here's going to be the challenge as we go, is that you have to remember which ones we've already done, which I think I can help you out if you mistakenly call one out. Do people have another one they want to hear? Frankenstein's margins. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is probably the first book that I loved as a scholar. I had loved many books before that one as a reader, but Frankenstein, which I read for the first time in high school, was a book I came to love through working with it. When I think about how that love was generated, there's an obvious physical practice that comes to mind, which is annotation. I think part of what excited me about annotating the novel was the fact of ownership. 10th grade was the first year that I went to a private school in my town where, shockingly to me, we owned the books that we used in class, which meant not only that we were allowed to write in them, but also that we were supposed to write in them. And because it was an elite school, there was no mechanism in place for selling books back. You bought them and you kept them, which was a struggle for my parents and perhaps one of the reasons that I work in open education now. But I can't tell you the transgressive joy that I felt when I selected colored highlighters to code to different themes in my copy of Frankenstein. In my copy, my book, the act of annotation somehow transformed that novel into something that was mine. As I worked over the years with Frankenstein, my marginal notes became increasingly interested in the marginalization and feminization of Victor's creature, the monster. My marginal notes revealed a radical novel inside of Mary Shelley's original radical novel. And I felt a sisterhood with Shelley and with her creature that was truly powerful. In graduate school, marginal annotation was the lifeblood of my scholarly existence. Samuel Purchas was a 17th century British armchair traveler who wrote pamphlets to encourage white settlement in the Americas. I annotated those pamphlets until the text became illustrations of the violent roots of colonial exploration. Reading became an act of resistance, a project of revisionist history aimed not at whitewashing the past, but revealing its brutal racism. I like the idea of a text's margins being a space to amplify the marginal subtext and make visible the marginalized experience, or subvert the dominant discourse with critique. And I like that the act of annotating is an empowering one that ascribes ownership over the text through the democratic act of reading. The Marginal Syllabus is a brainchild of scholar Remy Callier, and it plays with all of this as it invites scholars to annotate articles on the web together. Using an app called Hypothesis that allows for public annotations to be layered on top of any website, scholars can meet up in the margins of an article and trade ideas, critique, and commentary. The Marginal Syllabus, we're told on their website, collaborates with authors whose writing may be considered contrary or marginal to dominant education and schooling norms. The Marginal Syllabus hosts and curates publicly accessible conversations among educators that occur in the margins of online texts via open web annotation. And the Marginal Syllabus mediates educator collaboration using Hypothesis. We can see the puns between the margin of a text and the margin of a culture, and the assumption that annotation can be a radical upset to the status quo. But margins are contested spaces, perhaps more so than texts. Author Audrey Waters, a radical voice in education for sure, went out of her way to block annotations on her website. At the time, Waters was openly licensing most of her work, and about the blocking of annotations on her site, she wrote, quote, "One of the accusations lobbed against me when I blocked annotations here was that I was attempting to exert some sort of authorial control over my work. Wrong. I was exerting control over my website." Even if Frankenstein were still under copyright, nobody would argue that my copy isn't mine to mark up however I wish. But when I read an article on Waters' website, I'm somehow entering a space that is her own, where the text there hangs somewhere between the author and the reader. The act of reading and commenting doesn't make that text mine in the same way that reading and commenting make Frankenstein mine. Printing it out or copying an openly licensed version on her article onto my own site, that would do it. But on her site, it's hers as she conceived of it. At first, this confused me. How did this fit with the kind of open learning that I was interested in doing with my students? Around this same time as I was pondering Waters' choice to prevent annotation on her site, I was teaching a course in first-year college composition. Many of my students were creating their own blogs, and we were using Hypothesis a lot to comment on each other's work and on class readings. Well, one of my students was a shy young woman who took a brave and calculated step to write about her own story, how she came out as a lesbian to her conservative rural farm family just a few weeks before our semester began. It was a sad, honest, and hopeful essay, beautifully written. She was proud of it and happy with her decision to post it on the web. We all know that social media can be vicious and that being a lesbian or a person of color or any other number of marginalized identities can mean that you'll suffer far more than your fair share of abuse, threats, and trolling online. But suddenly I realized that there in the margins of her own site, her domain of her own, annotations could appear that would attack her for who she was and who she chose to reveal on her website. I love that scholars routinely show up in annotation flash mobs to correct gross and intentional errors in online articles that call climate change a hoax. That feels like the way the margins are leveraged to challenge centralized power and create a narrative of resistance. But like open education, we should expect that once the power of margins are revealed, that they will be co-opted by the powerful to reinscribe that power. When I spilled a bunch of coffee, well, my husband spilled a bunch of coffee on my copy of a book called How Humans Learn, it only magnified my love for this book, because now it was marked up, stained with coffee, nobody's book but mine. It's written just for me because the margins of this stained up book are filled with all the specific things I plan to do with the book when I run my own learning community for faculty at my own institution. But now I wonder about ownership, and I wonder about rewriting, and I wonder about how we can be sure of where the margins are and where the center is when power is so provisional. When I think about trying to work in the margins or design learning ecosystems that value marginalized voices, or imagine educational ecosystems that are decentralized or decentering, then I wonder how we'll avoid having those margins weaponized back against us. Once we develop a sense of comfort in the margins, and that comfort becomes power, and that power consolidates, who will be pressed out? I don't have answers to any of this. I generally use my margins for questions. So a question for this would be, what are some ways that you can imagine students or scholars using public digital annotation to speak truth to power? But what are some of the ways that you can imagine scholars or students being silenced by public digital annotation? I'm really curious, does the internet have margins? And what should we be doing with them for learning? And what should we be doing with them for the public good? If anyone actually has the presence of mind to be writing coherent answers to these questions and like tweeting them out right now, I would be so impressed. I saw a hand, I'm not sure what it is, yeah. Oh, they're running with you for a microphone. There you go. Now Maha's going to juggle microphones. I heard, yes, but I think you can keep going and I can rephrase. Now they're going to turn the microphone on. I'm just narrating for those at home.
Thank you. You're a beautiful writer.
And that's the third time she had to say that I'm a beautiful writer, so far this is going peachy.
But I'm wondering if the margins isn't that what an interactive, maybe like a blog would be, or some sort of interactive chat forum. I like the idea. I like the idea. I love this idea of annotation and text, and that your dialogue and your experience changes the text and gives you ownership. I think that's experience, and that's what happens when we learn collaboratively. I'm wondering if this doesn't already exist and how we use social media to comment with each other. And I also just strongly want to say again, I think you're a beautifully lyrical writer. Yeah, that's what I really wanted to say.
This is like, I didn't think in the middle of the presentation people would stop and just compliment me on the writing. It's lovely. Yeah, I mean, and you're asking a really good question too, which is about how you identify which parts of a text are margin, right? Are the side versus the thing. I've seen some really interesting projects emerge where there's kind of a sparse text in the center and then commenting happening that's so robust that that actually sort of supplants the original thing. But it also has to do with what you're talking about there with what makes academic writing and the question of the blog voice in some ways as being a commenting voice rather than a centered voice. It's one of the reasons I love blogging so much is that permission that you have to almost always be in dialogue with something as opposed to in monologue. And I think that can be really a powerful way for us to introduce students to the idea of learning, that it's not always putting your paper out, which is sort of your broadcast monologue, but it's also about putting your ideas out and expecting there to be comment back. So I think all of this is related, right? The quality of writing that we can do on the web when we can engage with other people is a great kind of quality for learning, I think. I'm so glad that you just offered that up, and I hope other people will just keep, that's a great way to do it. I'm trying to think if that actually leads us to, well, we could, if you want, we could go to what needs opening, which is a little bit about open education and might get at some of that stuff. I see nodding as if you're just going to be like, no, Robin, we want frame of reference. And I'm just going to remind you that some way or other, depending on your channels, we are going to get you this whole thing so that you'll be able to read them all. But this is a totally unpoetic graph, like just to say, you know, if it's less lyrical now, perhaps, in the graph. But when I started working in open, it was because I realized that I could make a free version of my early American literature textbook, save students $90 US each. And that kind of money is a drop in the bucket for New Hampshire undergraduates who have the highest student loan debt in the United States and the lowest state funding for higher education. Yay for my state. But it's precisely because debt's so high and college is so expensive that the textbook cost matters so much to my students. When we started using the new free anthology, students were grateful to save that money. When we started using the open anthology, I started becoming more knowledgeable about open education in general, and I learned about how many students withdraw or drop out of courses because they can't afford the textbooks. And just to describe the slide, I'm showing some statistics on those that show the large number of students who withdraw, fail, because they can't afford learning materials. It stunned me, even though I've always had students in my classes who can't afford the book, and I always notice that not having the book makes it harder for them to do well, of course. But confronting these statistics was a bit of a shocker for me. It wasn't so much that I got more concerned about textbook costs, it was that I started wondering what other access issues are preventing my students from coming to the table to learn. I started a food pantry in my academic department the semester after I started using OER, and these were part of the same gesture, to reach back into students' lives to find the barriers that were preventing them from learning and offer a small bridge across. The biggest issues in the US right now beyond tuition costs are the costs of learning materials, food insecurity, transportation costs, childcare costs, and lost opportunity costs. What would happen if I started seeing these not as issues for student life to address or some other office, but academic issues that I as a faculty member should address as I design curriculum, order supplies, and create program and course policies? As I expanded my understanding of what constitutes an academic issue and learned more about the challenges my students were facing in enrolling in and completing college, I began to understand that open was less about low cost and more about access. We could reduce costs at my own institution by curtailing library hours or increasing class sizes, and at various times we have indeed done those things. But that does not increase student access to learning. Cost savings alone does not guarantee increased access. Even making college free wouldn't mean that single parents or those in remote areas without access to a car would be able to come to college. What I really cared about was access, not cost. And once I cared about access, I approached every learning design challenge with a new lens. How can I make this more accessible to more learners? I worked on facilitating a peer-to-peer childcare co-op. I learned how to caption my videos and create posts that were friendlier to screen readers. I researched homeless shelters in my area and made sure I could advise students who were housing insecure on their options. I advocated for a laptop checkout program in my school library, created more flexible grading parameters for late work, and designed alternative syllabi for ill students who needed modified course schedules in order to avoid class withdrawal during chemotherapy. Basically, I did everything I could to ask, what is preventing this student from learning, and what could I do to reduce that barrier? And then this provoked me to ask another question. Why is access to knowledge important? It's a question that we don't ask very often because it seems patently self-evident. But if you press just a bit, the other part of open opens up. The reason I want my students to be able to learn is that I believe they should all have a part to play in shaping our future world. I think less about training students than I do about empowering them to transform. This goes for labor markets and for culture. I think most of us hope both that our students will be successful, but also that they'll have some say in what constitutes success, that they will imagine and enact a world that's an improvement over the one that we currently teach them about. The question of accessibility led me to the issue of empowerment, since access to knowledge seems important only if you pair it with access to knowledge creation. It wasn't the power of the 5 R's that made me excited to use OER, and it wasn't the fact that OERs cost nothing or the fact that they carry an open license. It was that suddenly I had a framework for understanding teaching that seemed broad and brilliant enough to keep up with the actual work. I knew that every day my students were struggling with life or death issues that were wrapped up tightly in how they came to or were prevented from coming to the material in my classes. And I knew that every day their paradigms were shifting as they learned. And I knew that every day those paradigm shifts and those life or death challenges were coalescing into something that my students understood about the world, something that was new, important, and worthy of being heard. When my students gain access to knowledge, I want it to be part of a larger invitation. We trust that you have important lessons to teach the world, and we trust that the knowledge you access today will be changed by your perspective, that you will open doors to new ideas that we, your current teachers, never could have taught you. The next world will be built by the ideas we haven't yet heard, and the University of the Margins is where we will nourish its architects. So for this, I think, what is a barrier that students face in entering or completing your course or program that your course or program is currently not explicitly addressing? How could your course or program, not some other office, but you, inside of your course or program, explicitly reduce that barrier for students? And why does that matter not only for students, but also for the knowledge in your field? Okay, Maha has spoken. She says, one more. Oh gosh, but I love them all. They're all my children. I vote for, well, you know, for Maha, I'd say hallway conversations, but I might vote for no margin, no mission if I got to, just because I'm feeling kind of like peeved about that right now.
University. Like, let's start no fees.
No fees.
No fees for education.
No fees, yeah. I mean, Everybody
Not on the
applauds because we're all good with that. And then you go into the committees, right? And they say, okay, well, where's the money going to come from? And that question that budgets are value statements is one that I always go back to. Is it that we don't have the money for something, or that we've put the money in other places? And I think that's one of the questions. Do you mind if I go, since I only have this one more? Oh, you want to do hallway conversations? I really think we should do no margin, no mission. This is so counter. What? Yeah, but you do see what I just did there. I was like, it's going to be so democratic and participatory. And then you're all like, hallway conversation. I'm like, no. The reason that we're going to do this one, though, is, and not hallway conversations, is that Maha's going to be, we're all going to be talking, I think, more about virtually connecting. But that's what that one's about, and I hope you'll check it out and join us even for that. But this one is one that's just really stressing me out right now, and I feel that we should all be stressed together. American inventor Thomas Edison is famous for saying that vision without execution is hallucination. And commenter Thomas Friedman revised this and said, vision without resources is a hallucination. Lots of Thomases have apparently been concerned with what happens when vision floats off detached from material reality. Without a profit-making enterprise, a business that collects more money than it spends, there is no educational mission. This quote comes from the Consultant Consortium for Higher Education Accreditation and Compliance. Yes, that's a mouthful. And it brings into stark reality how the philosophies of the Thomases are playing out in higher education these days. While we might all understand and even champion the idea that we need to plan strategically and concretely in order to enact our aspirational visions, and that we need to adequately fund those plans in order to succeed, we generally think of mission as something that precedes execution. This quote comes from an article entitled "No Margins, No Mission," a familiar refrain across higher education at this point. What happens when revenue doesn't just enable mission, but drives it? In the United States, we're starting to see monthly closures of small private universities whose financial bottom lines sink too far into the red for recovery. We're seeing consolidation in public systems at regional campuses as they get absorbed by flagships in the hope of preventing financial devastation. And with the exception of our most elite colleges with the most bloated of endowments, we all struggle with budget constriction and a general climate of austerity. So what happens to our missions when our financial margins shrink and we react out of anxiety to protect our institutional futures? What do words like efficiency, consolidation, innovation, trim, critical mass, and market demand mean for learners and programs on the margins? Institutions have shrinking financial margins. They have little margin for error. When we consider who and what is marginalized at our institutions, we should worry that one kind of margin is going to do violence on another. This is a tale of two margins. I think we need to insist that we attach the idea of cost to both of these kinds of margins. What's the cost of an academic program? What will it mean to the financial margins of the institution if it is cut? What are the costs of not having an academic program? How will it affect the trajectory of the world's knowledge and, relatedly, how humanity develops? Ethnic studies is a good example of a program that has costs to run that could possibly reduce an institution's financial margins. But there are also costs to cutting ethnic studies: increased hegemony in academic research and in academic disciplines, decreased representation in academic content and communities for people, including students of color, shutting down of interdisciplinary connections and collaborations with academic fields that do not value or leverage diversity, and on and on. We don't know all the benefits to learning that we lose when we cut programs that we call marginal, because we've not taken the time to understand the value of these programs outside of financial metrics. Some might argue that we need to recast the value of ethnic studies in financial terms, and as I implied above, I actually think we can. I've spent the last 5 years working in a program that serves customized majors. Every student makes up their own program. In an era of consolidation, our program looks on the surface like the least efficient idea on the planet. We mostly support the program with personal one-on-one advising, and it's nobody's model of efficiency. But for a host of reasons, I can explain why we are a cash cow for our university. And our institution has noticed that, resourcing us with new lines and support when the institutional budget is beyond tight. But I am not going to explain how we generate that revenue right now. Because those arguments are easy and common, and I personally make them every day. And sometimes I think that every time I make them, I set things back, even when I win a new resource for our program. The problem is that all of our missions grow from conversations about financial margins and not from conversations about the value, academic, human, humane, of the margins of our communities and the margins that gesture towards our intellectual potential. When we recast our arguments for serving vulnerable populations or saving, expanding, creating academic programs in terms of the financial bottom line, we think about cost and value only in economic terms, which is only one of the metrics that matter. Of course, it matters a lot. Institutional solvency matters because we serve learners and learning, and institutions where budgets are tightest serve learners who are least likely to enroll in college at all if our institutions close. But we've muddied up our mission by letting revenue drive our assessment of costs and value, and we've not spent nearly enough time thinking about the ethics and violence of building financial margins at the expense of clearing marginalized, not marginal, programs and people from our learning communities. Perhaps you too can think of a time when the financial margins at your institution dictated your mission, or a time when your mission was undercut by budget cuts. The question is, how does this matter to you and to your students? So I think, so first I want to remind you that there's a whole host of things here. We're going to talk later in dialogue when you look about Trump, about skin cancer, about online video web conferencing. So there's a trove of things in there that I hope that you'll explore and connect with me about. And that you'll send me your stuff, because I really think, even if I don't get that much, it'd be quite wonderful to try to weave in some of your examples from your institutions across many countries. But also you might send an image with nothing else. If you can link it to a title, it will help me put it in the right place, but if you just want to send something general, that's fine as well. I would very much like to interact with you in the months following this keynote.
Robin, can you show your email again? Because people were asking how to contact you.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, so those are three great ways to be in touch, including that Google Doc there that you can bookmark. I'm happy to take questions. I know it's not really the kind of thing where there'll be cut and dry questions, but I am really happy to speak to any of this, or just to talk about open education or open pedagogy, which are kind of the things I mostly work on in my own daily practice. I know they'll come.
Maybe I missed something, but did you mean by the margins or diversity to include people with special needs and students with special needs? Because we are this is coming up a lot.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think has been really helpful for me personally, when I started working in open and I turned my focus not to cost, which is so important. I mean, particularly where I am in the United States, my students have many of my students drop out of school because they can't afford to finish. But when I started thinking about that more as an access issue than a cost issue, many things opened up to me. And one of the things that opened up was, even just starting with learning materials, the accessibility of learning materials. And through working on OERs in particular, I started asking the question, with OERs, we could kind of just rebuild the world we currently have only for free, right? So the textbooks look the same, and somebody comes along with a vision impairment, and we retrofit the OER textbook the same way the disability office would retrofit a conventional textbook. And it just seemed to me that if we build instead a new ecosystem for learning with access at the core, we'll end up building radically different kinds of learning environments. It doesn't mean that I'm perfect at doing this, but what it does mean is that every time I sit down now to create a video or a quiz, I mean, just anything, I'm asking questions in my head about how to make it more accessible to students. My keynotes have changed dramatically. I didn't used to write anything, and I think to a certain degree that was better a lot of times, right, because it was more colloquial. But to have the transcript is very important for people to be able to follow along, so I've shifted that. But I've also tried to be even more radical in some ways, which is a luxury I think that you get when I'm a tenured full professor, and some of the things I think I would not have been able to try earlier in my career. But for example, I have a student now that I'm working with. He's focused in kind of physics and space is what his major is. And he's very, very talented in the sciences, but he has enormous processing issues. And he also has very difficult time communicating to the point where he actually can't be in a room with multiple people. So can you go to school at a school that doesn't offer fully online education if you can't be in a room with multiple people? So here's the thing I came to. The guy is brilliant. He's got these incredible ideas. Like the work that he does in physics is wonderful. But there's a lot of work that he's not going to be able to do in the conventional ways. We just figured out what he needed, and we set it up for him in my office. Now, it took a lot of time, a lot of resources, and a team of people. But without that, we don't get his voice in the future of knowledge, which is so important. And I just started thinking, I also had a number of students this past year who had cancer, including a woman who's really inspired me, who passed away young. She was 19 years old. And Tiffany taught me a lot of things because she wanted to continue learning even when she was going through chemo. The school pressured her very strongly to withdraw from the semester because she simply couldn't keep up in the same ways. We had to do all sorts of things to allow for her learning to continue while she was so ill. But the value, you know, she was majoring in patient advocacy. Okay, that was her. Can you imagine the value of the work that she produced in those final 6 months of her life as a scholar of patient advocacy going through terminal cancer? What do we lose if we don't make those accommodations, right? But what I really tried to do was, instead of accommodating these individual students, I tried to figure out how could my program accommodate a very ill student? Like, could it be ready for the next student? And wouldn't you know, the next semester, I had a student who had cancer and needed to go and have chemo, and I said, don't worry. We know how to do this. We're ready, and you can do this however you need to, because we had shifted the program based on what we learned from Tiffany. And he's doing great, by the way. But that's part of what I'm interested in, is instead of those one-off accommodations that look like the old system, trying to radically open things as we go, to say, if somebody wants to learn, it is my only job to facilitate that, right? It's the only thing. And sometimes you have to do stuff that, you know, your colleagues look at you and they say, oh, that's not, you know, acceptable in the parameters. But if it facilitates learning, you know, I think I'm there for it. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. On your open to openness, it made me think of education post-conflict zone. There's not a lot of research in the field, but Harvard has done a lot, and there's a female faculty member who has probably the most published material on it. And I think that those, what she's learned applies to situations in the United States where you have kids that are facing issues like homelessness or being hungry or, you know, food security that interfere with their learning. Because we saw it, electricity issues and water issues, how it affects our kids' learning in northern Iraq. So I think there's overlap. We think education post-conflict is over there, but we can bring it back to the United States, our mutual home countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things here is about, the shadow of the wall in the United States right now, Trump's wall, and the impact of, here we are building open labs and open learning and open spaces, and, what does the university have to say about immigrants and refugees? Like, I guess I have a problem with even, creating open space in the library as if open is a value that we all ascribe to, and then having nothing to say when borders are closed, right? These things are related. So the university is a part of the political zone that it inhabits, and for us to push those issues outside, I think, ends up keeping lots of our learners outside as well. And I can't even tell you just the small reactions, like when a student comes in and is complaining about money or whatever, and I said, well, do you need a gas card? Here's a gas card to help you drive. $15 gas card, right? And it's like the heavens open up because they can't believe that the institution cares about their humanity, right? It would be nice if that wasn't such a surprise to students, I think. Yeah.
Expressing yourself once you were tenured. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I mean, many institutions, so I'm not sure if it will be the case for all of you, but when we're talking about precarity, we're talking not just about our students and the precariousness of their march towards graduation. I think in my school, we're lucky if we maybe have 60% of our students graduating. But the precarity of our faculty. So at my school, not only do we have a very large number of contingent faculty who are hired semester to semester, but we also have a new thing that we call contract faculty, which are benefited full-time faculty, but they are non-tenured, and they are also hired year to year. In general, there's just a move, right? So part of this is cost savings and austerity for sure, but I think one of the problems with tenure is that we haven't really articulated what it's for very effectively, and taking risks in your field and your scholarly field is important, but there's also risks in pedagogy and risks in teaching when you want to be innovative and try something. And my program went from 1974 to 2014. The interdisciplinary program that I direct averaged 10 students per year, right? It's just a very, quote unquote, marginal program for odd students doing weird things, right? The people we love. When I took over in 2014, I really pulled in, basically I ran it as an open pedagogy program. So not only did we convert to OER, but we converted to a lot of learner-directed curriculum and just really fully went there and everything, which I was able to do despite a lot of sort of shocked looks from my colleagues, because I had some gravitas and I had this security that if it didn't work, I was still going to be okay. Our enrollments now are about 120 students. We're one of the largest programs in the university over the course of the last 4 years. It turned out this was what students needed, but I don't think I would have been able to take that risk professionally if I hadn't had the job security to know that taking a risk was going to be okay. So what do we give up when we have a precarious faculty is the ability to change, because we fail a lot, and I failed a lot in that great success, right? The biggest success of my career. Multiple small failures, any one of which might have done me in if I didn't have the security to know that I was safe in my position. So it's a real problem, I think. Teachers need tenure too, not just scholars.
Okay. Thank you, Robin. And Robin is still here for the rest of the day if you want to talk to her. And there are a couple of other structured opportunities to talk to Robin, Cheryl, and Anita. Today at 3:15, there's going to be a virtually connecting session. We're trying to figure out where it's going to be. We'll try to announce it once we know. That's us talking to people who aren't at the conference or at the margins, watching from afar. But you can join in, you can watch, or you can join the session if you'd like. It's probably going to be in one of the rooms while the exhibition is happening at 3:15. And tomorrow at 10:30, Robin and I are facilitating a Birds of a Feather on open educational practices, where we'll go deeper into some particular ones and hopefully listen from you all to ones that you're familiar with. This is such a weird mic. Alex needs 5 more minutes. And thank you, Robin, so much.